Welcome to Salt and Pepper, a connected podcast production. I'm your host. You can call me Bree, and I'll be introducing our episode this week. Each week, we will discuss the hottest topics in diversity, equity, and inclusion. But be not fooled by the name. Most of our subjects are far more complex than black and white. Our podcast is perfect for educators, administrators, and emerging leaders in K-12, higher education, public, and private sectors. You can submit questions by Monday of each week on our site, www.connecteducationgroup.com, and subscribe for early access to weekly recordings of webinars, podcasts, and panel discussions. Let's get into what's shaking this week. Doing background reveal. Okay, I'm going to take a picture so you look at the camera, your camera, and then we're going to smile. Got it.
All right, take my mask off. It's the face reveal. How's it going, Bree?
It is going well. It is going well.
Nice.
Very well. I'm gonna.
Let me tell you, the Zoom screens. I was on this webinar. I was like a consultant featured on a webinar the other day. Mm-hmm. And I had one of our other ones, Stronger Together, up, and wild. It went wild. Oh my gosh. Let me tell you. So this whole district now wants Stronger Together in their colors.
Nice.
I know, because it's like, who doesn't have Zoom fatigue, right?
Well, you got to spice it up. You got to find a way to make it better. And if you we would start with what's shaking, right? So our schedule today, Battle of the Backgrounds.
Right.
Woo-hoo, Zoom background reveal. Did that.
I think you win. I like yours. I give you a 9.5.
I love yours for messaging, right? I approached it from a different space. This week, I will say with the Breonna Taylor fight for social justice, I would say in the work it was unique, helping people understand the difference between a settlement, right, and the role that can have in systemic change, but also how sometimes we get burned out for the silo fight, right, where you feel it's more siloed of. Did we do all of that for a settlement? And it's not realizing that exactly. And there's levels to that. And so, the settlement is saying that there's certain reforms that will come along with it. And so I think much more intrigued by not necessarily the fact that she was awarded a settlement, right? Because how do you place value on a life? So not really to change the narrative and to say the dialogue really has to be about what systemic change now can the community really guide in this work and really help to shape, even thinking about our BCA course, the course that we have for law enforcement, an 8-credit course all about diversity in a multicultural society. That's a part of the solution, but that's also, it was upon us to say there was a need for that in this work. And so it's much easier to say, that's not justice, right? And to get bogged down with it's not our vision of justice, it's not what we were looking for. You have to also point out that there's two sides. There's the criminal side and there's the civil side, and this just represents one part. So the fight is hardly over. But it's looking at, for students, be it students' role in understanding activism, right? And if we're talking about our college students who aren't necessarily on campus with their counterparts, having that opportunity to feel that they're actively doing their part, right? They feel sometimes that their work right now is performative in nature. All they can do is a post from their student organization, or all they can do is something that is symbolic, but really that is a role. It's a critical role, and it really helps to spread consistent messaging that can combat sometimes when people simply just don't understand that this is a step in the right direction
and it's keeping the pressure up. We got to keep the pressure up. There's always this influx of activism, right around when something happens, and then it wanes, and I don't think that it's shocking that leaders, organizational leaders, they know if they just weather the, small storm, that it's going to pass and the sun's going to shine. So we got to
Right.
let people know that the sun's not going to shine till there's change. And
Exactly.
to your point about like the BCA course, I know there needs to be change. We know there needs to be change in the K-12 area, but we also know that law enforcement programs need to change because we got to get to people early to make that culture shift.
Exactly. And uniquely, when you talked about like law enforcement change, on the spectrum of what our work, how our work uniquely is shaped as educators, we will produce the next class of law enforcement officers,
Hmm.
right? Or whatever that work will be. So it's upon our institutions, our organizations to say, if not, my theme of the day, I feel like is we shouldn't necessarily focus on the now, but also the next, right?
Hmm.
So if the civil rights movement that came before us did not do a lot of that heavy lifting, it's the heavy load that we would be bearing today. And so it's easy to feel like we're not doing enough for justice, we're not getting enough justice, and maybe you won't get enough right now. But if you're going to position it where more justice can be provided for the next generation and for those who we will once hand this world over to, I think that that's also something that we have to celebrate, something that we have to consider as being a part of the solution, and start to critically think about if in this way, if there were an investment in this work, how would we want to see that investment divided, right?
Yeah.
How should we disaggregate the efforts? So there's so many different layers to what it means to seek justice in this
And
way, but in any way.
I think it's hard because so many people don't understand how important history is
Mhm.
and how the historical trauma that our underrepresented communities have faced still is a part of the fabric of the system that we're in now, you know? And like, I think about it's Latinx Heritage or Hispanic Heritage Month, right? We're right on that,
Mhm.
and I think about like our deck, like our Latinx Heritage deck. There it is. And that deck is all really giving the context of history,
Mhm.
for especially for our pigmentally challenged community, student community, even faculty and staff community, for them to really think about the history as they're looking at current events today. And yesterday, really in the news, the revelation, even though I think it's been happening for a long time, that we're taking um, we're taking primarily Latinx people, women that are in detention, and where our government is using them for experiments.
Mhm.
I mean, that came out in the news, and it's just this absolutely horrific thing, and yet there's historical roots in that work
Well,
in what they're doing.
even in our backyard, what's unique
Mhm.
is when we saw that, it defaulted to my experience with going through my first time childbirth. But one
Mhm.
of the things that a lot of people didn't realize is when you get to the clinic, there was a form that was only available in one language, and it talked about did you want to pursue a hysterectomy? It did not
Right.
use that language, but it
Mhm.
was describing, by all accounts, a hysterectomy. I
Mhm.
only wonder how many new immigrant women or women where English were not their first language encountered that form in an everyday clinic. So
Mhm.
not really as far fetched, right? We like to sometimes the news will sometimes paint the picture that these are not issues that are also like I said, right in our backyard, that are things that when we talk about language, when we talk about really where we are today, and when we get into even where we're going with our conversation, which will be our flashpoint focus, right? Things that we've seen in the media, and really defining for our audience or people who may not be aware, right? That a flashpoint, they're climate related incidents or events that disrupt the campus or greater community in which the campus resides.
Mhm.
Monitoring campus flashpoints is just one tool to track bias incidents and hate crimes, both within and around the campus, school, or organization. And so,
And you look for trends,
right, you
look
can't.
for trends. Yeah.
Right. And when you think about trends, there's leading indicators, there's lagging indicators, and most times we follow lagging indicators, right?
Hmm.
Something that's not going to give us a leg up. It's actually going to set us behind. It's going to put us on another 3 to 5 year path of assessing something that if we would have started at a different point, we could already have seen we have that information, right?
Well,
So,
yeah, and we could go COVID crazy with that, right?
mhm, mhm,
But there's a recent Inside Higher Ed article that was talking about how roughly 3/4 of undergraduate students said they're worried about being able to stay on track and graduate given the virtual,
mhm,
hybrid, high flex thing.
mhm.
And then it mentions, well, rates are even higher among Black 84% and Latinx 81% students, and that many of them are saying it's an increasing concern that they may not come back in the spring. That
Exactly.
Pell eligible students are saying probably not coming back in the spring. And the irony to me about the article is it's kind of hinging on the whole COVID thing, and yet we know that these have been issues for a long time.
Exactly.
We've got issues surrounding the retention of underrepresented students that you and I wrote a book about.
Exactly.
Ours for retention was just focused on that before COVID. This has been
Exactly.
a while ago that we wrote that book. So um, the whole idea that they want to hang it on the COVID situation. Yeah, COVID adds another layer, right?
Exactly.
But
A layer of
yeah, the
exposure.
trends are there. You
It
know.
removes the invisible cloak of acting like the invisible cloak of ignorance, right? Is what I
Hmm.
would call it. This invisible cloak of ignorance that says we have not had to address these issues, therefore we did not, right? And so thinking even about institutions that are saying we're going to temporarily, as a result of COVID, do away with the ACT requirement. We have historically Black colleges and universities for the first time saying we're going to temporarily suspend this
Right.
requirement. And
Right.
it's what is the magic of temporarily doing it? Why temporarily make a change for equity? Even the school lunch program? Why do it in the short term without realizing that we've made these changes for COVID, but they've helped expose systemic issues in our society, in our organizations, in our schools?
Mhm.
That COVID is just really, like you said, if it were an onion, it's just peeling back one layer of those issues. It's not all of the layers.
And there's a lot of institutions that have been test optional for many years. And a lot of the privates have gone test optional. Our neighbor down the road, Gustavus, has been test optional for years.
Mhm.
So I think it's interesting that suddenly we got all this press in the March April time period of, look at these schools, they're not requiring tests.
Mhm.
Like, oh yeah, that's not a new idea. And
Exactly. It's
maybe,
probably been in a campus climate assessment prescription of a recommendation
or it should have
to,
been.
right,
Yeah.
to diversify your campus in one way or
Mhm.
another, is to look at the way that the ACT or standardized testing in general has done more to impede upon the success of marginalized communities than it has to advance. And in fact, just what was the last year we saw from the ACT scandal, or the SAT scandal, where those who were from a higher socioeconomic class were actually using standardized testing and the ability to test for the test, right? Teach the test
Mhm.
to their students using private school tutors, private school coaches to ensure their students were getting a higher score for that
But see,
purpose.
it's more palatable to blame it on COVID than to blame it on the truth, which is those tests are geared toward white men,
Uh-huh.
right? So there's bias in the testing. There's bias, like you said, in the prep for it and the ability for people to, actually know the content of the test ahead of time. And we know where that's skewed on the white side.
Hmm.
But when you start talking about that in an institutional setting, there's reticence for whiteness is always white people are always going to resist the undoing of itself, right, dear white
Hmm.
people.
Hmm.
So the same goes true with test optional. You put a bunch of people, higher ed people in the room, faculty and otherwise, and say, we want to talk about ACT, SAT as a testing requirement. Oh, we got to keep that in. We won't get quality, right, in our students.
And it's also when we talk about subversive language, right? What's embedded when you talk about quality? It's really in the most microaggressive way, trying to say that a student's ability to pass a test is greater than the contributions that their intercultural being will bring to that campus. It's really saying that your extracurriculars don't matter. It's about your ability to understand this information. And I think that as we talk about flashpoints, one of the things that I found is that flashpoints in the media are heavily saturated with the COVID-19 narrative. Right? So essentially, it's really this thing of saying there's so many levels of bias incidents taking places on campus today. There are faculty and staff, right, who don't feel comfortable in their classrooms. And so the policies, the things they're putting in their syllabi to try to really hold on to that campus based experience in distance learning. So looking at policies that are addressing really distance learning etiquette. What does that look like? And really how it positions students to shame how they live, and it conditions students to not really be able to realistically endure trying to be educated through a pandemic, right? If I use a Zoom background, it shouldn't be shunned upon, where some educators have said no Zoom backgrounds. But then you have to think about how some students have also used even Zoom backgrounds to portray bias messaging and hate crimes, right? So as we're thinking about almost nearly so many K-12 students that I saw this week were using their background, not a Zoom background, but their actual background. They had created a poster, a wreath. There was a photo. They tried to personalize their space to really show uniqueness. And in that way, you also have students trying to combat that. So one of the flashpoints that I didn't share here, but that's from K-12, was a young girl who encountered a white youth, and he was talking about her skin color. He was talking about her features. And essentially her response to him was, my brown is beautiful. My black is beautiful. And this boy beat this young girl to the point she was hospitalized. And we talk about, how what's the difference in between a bias incident? What's the difference in between a hate crime? And as we're thinking about how we crouch all of that under the label of a flashpoint, whether it's, a thing that really shows that there are students who are doing on Snapchat, they're reenacting, the murder of George Floyd, the assassination of George Floyd, rather. So you have these students who are still in distance learning, carrying out bias incidents, but you don't have practitioners readily available or understanding, how do I handle this, right? And so one of the things that I saw from the higher ed aspect was all local Michigan State University students have been asked to self-quarantine immediately for the next 2 weeks to contain the exponential growth of COVID-19, right? And you're looking at an institution or really a state this week that has really been highlighted on a couple different levels as it relates to how they're trying to combat COVID-19. So one is we have this on the left, a group of students from Oxford, Ohio, who where almost the entire house was diagnosed with COVID-19, right? So they had about 30 people over there. 10 of them lived in the house and were diagnosed. They were quarantining, but having a quarantine party with those who did not live there, who were not quarantined. And their answer were like, those people across the street, they have it too. And those people have it too. And so when we're looking at the personal response, the shift of responsibility to monitor, to be active in this fight, we saw a university try something called quarantine housing. And students, it went viral when students complained, we don't have toiletries, we don't have basic essentials, we don't have linens. We're trying to essentially navigate a space without the essential tools. And I feel like that's been the nature of this work, right? The nature of equity is we're trying to do work without tools. So for my flashpoint focus for high school, I wanted to focus on this idea of mass bullying. And it's happening in levels, right? And it's really in schools, in secondary systems where mass bullying is a thing because people are getting, again, cosmetic with the mask. They're getting
Mm-hmm.
fashion with the mask. So you have some who are wearing designer masks, and you have some who are repeatedly, right? We have some who are repeatedly wearing something like this every single day. They're reusing the same. It's because it's what they have.
Right.
And some of them are saying, well, it's what I have because when I went to Walmart without one, it's what they gave me. I didn't
Right.
buy it. It's the standard of what's been given.
Right.
And it's non-medical. And so as we're thinking about the COVID-19 and the impact and the disparities that it's showing on BBI POC communities, I read the stat this morning that talked, I don't know if it was 90% of the children who have been impacted or died from COVID-19 have been from communities of color. And I think it sheds light on health disparities. But as we think about academic disparities, one of the things I found going on in Florida is virtual suspensions, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so this idea that mask rules, so the article said mask rules more trauma, why some worry a student discipline crisis is on the horizon. And a lot of educators are spending time managing student behavior right now. They're not having that opportunity to really focus on educating for that full time because they're managing your cameras off. Your camera needs to be on. So
Mm-hmm.
it's more about the etiquette of mask wearing, the etiquette of social distancing. And in all of that, sometimes it becomes nearly impossible to really make sure that you're touching all of the bases. And I guess lastly, I had an update for you on one of the biggest inequities I think that we've shared is the technological, right? The inequity of technology. And it's something that, and I expect equity, we've talked about with our educators before, but looking at when you have instructional inequities, meaning you don't have teachers. We have some teachers right now who are being placed on caseloads that they were not trained to teach simply because there's a shortage of teachers. There's teachers who have decided I'm going to take leave right now for my health. I'm not able to be in a classroom. Well, they're educating students who on subjects that they were not trained to teach. And so I give an update on the two students we saw who were in a Taco Bell parking lot to use the Wi-Fi. In their case, their institution had given them a loaner computer, but a loaner computer without internet, without a hotspot, right? And
Right.
so again, we see the funneling, right? The tunnel vision that if you apply to looking at inequities. So more than 136,000 was raised for the girls who were spotted in Taco Bell, and a GoFundMe is great. I applaud that work. But as I'm thinking about what it'll take to really have this never happen to another student, is we have to really get to a point of universal inclusion. We have to understand that I cannot give you the wireless device without the technology to make it work. That's like giving them that without a charger cord, right? Without
Right.
something to sustain the work. And so I'm seeing consistently the work of equity being pushed onto GoFundMe, being pushed onto
Right.
communities, and
Rather
it's
than
saying,
systemically supported.
and schools systemically saying, here's what it will cost to sponsor
Right. Right.
internet for every child. It's not about a graphic T-shirt, to make students have school pride right now. It's about how can students have pride in the work that they're
But we can
submitting.
brand the football stadium, you know.
Huh?
We can brand the football stadium. We got money to put up, signs and scoreboards and buy
Well, that's
uniforms.
that's
And,
exactly it. And it's
yeah.
this thing of being like, what if we change the narrative to be sponsoring or talking about the right message, right? Like
Mhm.
every youth does not have access to internet. Every youth does not have access to a computer. And there's levels. You have some who have access to computer, but it doesn't have the RAM space to be able to keep up with the Zoom calls and the videos and the bandwidth. And so, as we're thinking about this exploration of inequity, is what do organizations have the bandwidth to produce, right? What do organizations have the bandwidth to do to ensure that every single student has this universally inclusive experience?
Well, and I think that, too, it's about helping teachers, which I think we do in our workshops. We always see the light bulbs go on, but think through a lens that's different than their own. Like I was sitting with some coaches who were talking about high school coaches that were talking about the COVID situation and how yeah, we can have sports, but we're not going to be able to provide meals anymore. They can't eat on the bus. If they go to games and stuff, there won't be any food. They'll just have to bring their own. And I said, what about students that can't bring their own?
Mhm.
And they just looked at me like, who's that? Like, are there really
Right.
those people? And I said, and you're not providing water on the sideline. So what if people don't have a water bottle? So it's like in their mind, they can't imagine that. If they have kids, of course they would send, a sack dinner, or they would send
Mhm.
a, Under Armour water bottle, or a, fancy water bottle that full of water that would stay cold.
Mm.
It's really helping our educators realize that there's invisible discrepancies that you don't see. There's invisible um, marginalization that you don't see. So just because someone has a cell phone doesn't mean that they can afford to bring a dinner with them.
The visible inequities versus the invisible inequities, right? So looking at on a surface level, there's the known and the unknown. There's things that I know about this child that I can know, or that I have to take an effort to learn.
Mm-hmm.
So it's, does someone have to notify you they don't have internet, or do you have a process where they can anonymously submit that and you can identify that 60% of my class does not have access to internet, and therefore justify that need without singling out I'm doing it for one, right? And looking at, in all things equity, whether it be this equity check or the next, the reality is, if I do it for one, what impact is that going to have, and how can I proactively explore those options? So we're looking at two kids sitting outside of Burger King to use the Wi-Fi, and I can't help but think how as a society we failed, right?
Mm-hmm.
We failed those children to get to this point in this year in a pandemic and not have every student in an academic environment have
Well,
access to technology.
and what comes to mind when you talk about that is this, what you and I talk about is, equality versus equity,
Hmm.
and how the mentality of, well, if we do it for one, we got to do it for all. How we need to combat that. How we need to help people understand what equity really means. And makes me think of a class I was teaching to future educators in college, and there was one student of color in the class who came up to me and said, I don't have my book, and I'm not going to have my book until I get financial aid in 2 weeks. And I handed him my book.
Hmm.
And there were 4 or 5 other students that were standing around that heard that, and I hope they understood that.
Right.
I hope they understood what just happened there, because um, that student was going to be behind,
Yep.
because they didn't have a book.
But
Um,
sometimes you get students who will ask the question, and it makes it the equality narrative.
mhm,
Well, I had to buy my book, right?
right.
My parents had
Yep.
to do whatever, and they make it a, oh, well, this is what we had to do to get books. How come they couldn't have done it too, right? So even thinking about that experience from that, it really drives home, like you said, we're not talking about equality. That I did that for equity, and that is the justification.
Yeah, and the great thing is later in this semester, we actually had a class discussion about that situation, because the student said it was okay, where we talked about it, and what it meant to make sure that you understand the story of the students that you teach,
Hmm.
that you understand the individual stories,
Yeah.
and those stories aren't just based on color, right?
Right.
Those stories are based on the individuality of each student. You could have a student that you would not stereotype as possibly being in need, who is desperately in need of support, of some kind. So really helping teachers understand, you've got to know the students that you are teaching.
Yeah, and that the personal responsibility has to be on you to do that fact finding. It
Yeah.
can't be on the student. The moment is lost if the student. One moment.
Okay, we got like 10 minutes, right?
Okay, say what you said.
Hi.
Hi, Kelly. She said, I love Kelly and I hear her and I miss her.
And I love you and miss you too, sweet pea.
Okay, let me finish. That was sweet. I know you need to talk to people. Okay, that was awesome. I think about that responsibility. The moment is lost if a student has to report to you that they don't have a book, right? Really, because and not in that way. It's just really saying, my, did we as institutions not realize that we're putting up these barriers, right? That we are the one that decides that I'm going to use the road less traveled and create a curriculum, or I'm going to use the road less traveled and have a book for, those who want to and can afford a print copy, and then there's an ebook version that's going to be drastically less expensive, right? And so I think about the missed opportunity to get ahead of the curve, right, by proactively addressing the needs that we see. So to that point, if that instance didn't shape your work for next time, where you knew, oh, there are going to be some students who may not have a book on day one, right, you not embracing that realization that, all students are not starting at the same starting point. To level the playing field for equity, I wanted to be the one to say, I'm not going to be the difference in between you having a book and not having a book. I have the positionality and the power to replace this book, to get another book, right? And I'm willing to do that not only for this student, but any student who had come to me and said that. And that's all it takes. Equity is not whether or not you do it for every student, is did you do it for the one who needed it because they needed it, and it's because it would level the playing field for them with the other students.
Let's see what's on the menu. Questions from our listeners.
Do you have them? I totally didn't put that into the PowerPoint, so you let them rip.
Okay, well, I have several, but I'm just going to pick a couple here. Let's see. So, principal from an elementary school said, how young can you start diversity and equity training, and what does that look like in elementary school?
Awesome. I just had a conversation about that. I think that when we talk about early intervention and early literacy, as soon as children are able to learn to read, they're able to digest those advanced concepts. That's the time to start anti-racism and diversity education. There's a quote,
take it progressive,
right?
Like you have some great kids books.
Well, I was even thinking about Ibrahim Kendi, who is someone we know from higher ed and as in his anti-racism work, but very plainly in his children's book, he outlines that anti-racist babies are bred, not born. So I think about, be it our book that talks about microaggressions for Dante, it's really helping youth understand that we're talking about strengths, weaknesses, differences, opportunities, right? Things that we could have done better. It's shaping the narrative in a way where it's not using history to help them feel a certain way about what was done, but giving them the opportunity to have discernment and say, here's where I stand on these issues. Here's what I know about these issues, and here's the uniqueness that I can bring to impact change. And starting that conversation at the earliest age possible.
Well, and I think, like we talk a lot about like passive education, like you can't see it, but I have my it's not showing up. I have my name badges. There it is, kind of. You have yours. That we've had a lot of teachers buy and wear because they have great messaging, or it's posters in the room, or it's Zoom backgrounds, that passive education piece. But then whether it's books like you have that your daughter has written that you've really used to send a message to younger audiences, and then progressively getting students more involved in dialogue. So, like I think about our dialogue decks.
Exactly. Our social emotional learning decks.
Yeah. We have the whole student-based deck series. Those decks are questions that anyone can facilitate. Especially at, in that elementary, middle school range. So taking a day each week to have a diversity dialogue session.
Right.
whether that is flashpoints, things that are appropriate to talk about in the classroom, or it's just, putting a question out to the class to think about and consider. I think
Well,
you
and
have
really
to weave it in.
helping them to gain more questions and answers from you. Sometimes it's about sparking that passion for a student to explore the more questions, right?
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
so what I think about equity and leveling the playing field, and it goes all the way around, it's cyclical, really. Like when you think about whether I'm teaching equity to a child or to an adult, it's meeting them where they are and leveling the playing field and saying, we're not going to have an advanced level discussion on diversity if you're not there. Sometimes in anti-racist education, it's identifying your spectrum. What
Mhm.
is the where when will I have achieved actualization, right? We have our equity rubric, our trademark tool that really focuses on assessment for organizations to really say where are we today and where are we going in this work? How do we actualize our efforts? And so actualize anti-racist education,
Yeah.
actualize allyship has to be authentic, and it starts at the earliest age, at the earliest onset.
Well, and I think teachers too have found our classroom toolboxes really helpful. That those have sort of that sampling of things that they can do
On day
in the
one.
classroom, from passive to active education. And then really, like, you have to arm your teachers with the skills,
That's it.
so sending them to workshops, getting them connected to training, but then modeling it
That's
yourself.
that's what I was gonna say. The individual piece, the one-off workshops are great, but they have to
Hmm.
be a part of a solution. It's
Yeah.
a cumulative impact, and it's realizing that if I just do a one-off training to say I did it, we're not going to get to a point of actualized anti-racist education,
Right.
right, in our organization.
It has to be
However,
progressive.
if
Yeah.
every staff meeting we start with a singular
Right.
question and we build
Right.
upon that, if we build upon those conversations and realize it's not about ripping the band-aid off and saying how much can we talk about, how much racism can we digest today, it's really saying how can we take a step back and breaking this into chunks. Is this something that it's a year worth of work? It's something that we're going to progressively debunk, progressively approach. And how can we do that in a way where we're also honoring of the fact that each educator is at a different point in their personal journey in anti-racist work as well. And so there's my professional journey with anti-racist education, but it's also taking that ownership for your personal journey as well.
Yeah. And we had that we had a really awesome connection with the principal down south that took our email
Oh,
education kit,
uh-huh.
and then did exactly what you're talking about, a strategic plan that does he get to meet with all of his teachers as a team each week? No, that's a dream, right? But
Right.
he was sending out that educational email
The email blast, the
from our
prescribe, the templates, right? Where
from
you
our creating connections book,
got
so sending out those emails that talk about help people understand basic terms, or give people a quick quiz that they can take on their own, and it's all based on self-reflection. You read the email, you immerse yourself in it, and then you can take the additional step to learn more. But then weaving it into in-service training, as you said, really having a strategic plan that gets you from point A to point Z over time, and it's continuous. It's not something that ends.
and you
It's
can't
part
skip
of you.
steps. You can't skip steps. The
Right.
journey is one that is it goes, it's linear, it goes right in one direction. You can revert backwards, so I can't say that. But what I'm trying to say is that it's not something that I'm just going to get it this one time, right? It's
Right.
progressive. It's something that is ever changing. It's something that you have to be willing to be resilient in the work and change with the world. We're learning new things. We're seeing new things. We're within our own institutions. We're learning new things about the people we work with in doing this work, right? And so, one of our biggest things is how can you ignite the cavers? And
Yep.
so, I guess if I wanted to take a question that really focused, it's what is what is the role and the responsibility of melanin recessive colleagues, practitioners, professionals in anti-racism work?
Yeah. You mean pigmentally challenged?
Yeah, there we go.
Um, I mean, we need, and this is a white person talking, right? But we have to have white champions. We have to have people not who are out to save the day, but who are invested in using their power, either their power from privilege or their power by position, to be a part of the change,
Right.
to incorporate that courageous leadership into their daily work. And courageous leadership doesn't just come from a principal or a president, right? Courageous leadership comes from everyone.
Exactly.
So,
It's everybody doing their part every
yeah.
day. I think if I have one last thing about our Monday meeting, right? Is that what this is? Is this our Monday meeting?
This is Tuesday talk.
It's Tuesday talk, right? Our Tuesday talk.
So
So
this is for Tuesday.
one of the things that I'm enjoying is the ability to see equity work from so many different layers, so many different lenses. And one of the things that you just said kind of in your closing is that as we think about the role in anti-racism work, it's arming white people with the ability to have conversations with other white people about race. Mm-hmm. And for people of color from BBI-POC communities to not be the only people in the room who can have these conversations. Right. And so, to your point, right? Yeah. And to your point, right, about needing white champions, anti-racism work is that's at the core. It's trying to help those who are not necessarily impacted have a different layer of exposure into what that work entails and to how they can actively help move that work along that spectrum. For listeners, if you have questions, we will drop a link below or above, wherever it places it on this particular platform, for you to submit those questions for us to answer each week. We do some real-time question answering on Fridays. You have to be subscribed, so go to www.Kinect Education Group and start your growth journey today. With that being said, Kelly, Salt and Pepper, I'm signing off.
All right. See you
later.